Good afternoon and thank you. My name is Scott Shanley. I'm the city manager in Manchester. Also, I've worked in Enfield, Groton, and other places as well, and it's a somewhat nomadic career. I'm sorry you couldn't read the writing. I am not a physician. I wanted to speak on behalf of CCM on Senate Bill 367 concerning severe mental and emotional impairment and workers' compensation coverage. I'm not going to reiterate what you have from CCM. I wanted to take a minute to talk about a couple of the very practical issues with trying to deal with a piece of legislation like this. And I want to say right off the bat, we spend a lot of money on mitigation, and we need to. We take workers' compensation in Manchester very, very seriously. We want people healthy, we want people back at work, we want people engaged, and we never want somebody hurt on the job. That requires understanding what kind of ways you can mitigate risk. What can you do to ensure that you don't expose people to the kinds of risks that we're talking about? And when you're talking about showing up at a crime scene, the practical reality is that it's very, very difficult to mitigate that risk. What kinds of things would you have to do? How many times would an officer attend a scene that you would have to determine that they could no longer be an officer that attends the scene? We had an unfortunate situation several years ago where we had an employee walk into one of our larger employers, disgruntled, ended up shooting 8 of his co-employees and ultimately himself. At the scene, and I happened to be at the scene, one of the victims, in everybody's haste because the shooter was still active, was pulled to safety, unfortunately too late. We had dozens of police officers from multiple communities show up to the scene. Everybody saw the victim, dozens. How do you manage that, and what does that mean? We have, in workers' compensation, you have confined space training. So you have people who are not allowed to go into confined space unless they have had the kind of training necessary to be in confined space. You can manage that. How does one determine which employees, which police officers can and should or shouldn't or can and can't respond? What is our public safety responsibility? It's a very, very slippery slope. Not every city manager in the world has high integrity. Not every city manager in the world is beyond stretching rules. It is also true of police officers. Anybody who has run a city can tell you horror stories about trying to manage certain workers' compensation situations. So we have to be sure that we have systems in place to manage abuse. None of these things are in place. Are there best practices for resilience training to help people in advance of the situation be able to handle the situation that we traditionally think of as calling a police officer, a domestic violence call? I'm not aware of any. I think many of these things need to be in place and be structured and be negotiated prior to moving to this level of expected responsibility of the taxpayer, because it's not manageable. There's no way to put your arms around the exposure, and it could be huge. We have people who are out on workers' comp legitimately for 2 years, 3 years. That's not uncommon. Suppose you had an entire department. How do you backfill? How do you get somebody to respond to somebody else's call if you've made a determination that they can't, or they shouldn't, or they've been exposed once, you can't expose them a second time? These are all very difficult practical questions that I do not think are are addressed ahead of the legislation, and if we're going to have legislation like this, I do believe that they need to be addressed ahead of legislation. That's basically what I'd like to talk about.
Thank you, sir. Are there any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the time.
Representative Orange?